Hi, folks. We want to offer a quick trigger warning. We want everybody to find what is useful here, but this is, in fact, a podcast about trauma. So please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself while you're listening to the Whole Again podcast. Thanks. Hi, I'm Leslie.
And I'm Teddy.
Welcome back to the Whole Again podcast, a podcast about trauma and healing for survivors and the people who love them. It's the podcast that states we all, without exception, can be whole again. Also, the only podcast that comes with a daily joke. See, it worked.
Oh my God.
I'm your co-host, Leslie Briner, and with me is your other host,
Teddy McGinn-Wright. Welcome back, y'all. To recap a little, this is the first season of Whole Again Pod on the Integrative Trauma and Healing Framework, and what Leslie and I just refer to as the framework, which explores how trauma disintegrates us and how to reintegrate. You can jump in anywhere, but it definitely helps to listen to episode 1, where we lay out the foundations of what we're getting into together. We, of course, recommend that you listen to the whole season, but with that said, let's get into episode 2. Today's episode is all about bodies, all kinds of bodies. We'll dig into the second statement of the framework, that we embody trauma and healing across 5 layers: individual, collective, systemic, intergenerational, and historical. So we'll start by talking about bodies, and then embodiment, what that means generally and how we're using it in the framework. We'll also talk about dirt, well, technically soil. Then we'll begin our conversation about the 5 layers and the embodiment of trauma and healing across those layers. We say begin the conversation because in the next episode and the one after that, we'll be focusing on trauma as the interruption of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging across those layers, the healing and rebuilding of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging across those same layers. To close, like we do, we'll do a wrap-up with a practice and offer some opportunities for integration using these concepts. So, bodies. Whenever I'm teaching or training on embodiment, I pull this passage from Sonia Renee Taylor's ovular work, The Body is Not an Apology, which gives my favorite rationale for why it's crucial to include the body in conversations around trauma and oppression. She writes, "When we speak of the ills of the world, violence, poverty, injustice, we are not speaking conceptually. We're talking about things that happen to bodies. When we say millions around the world are impacted by the global epidemic of famine, what we are saying is that millions of humans are experiencing the physical deterioration of muscle and other tissue due to a lack of nutrients in their bodies. Injustice is an opaque word until we are willing to discuss the material reality, as, for example, the 3 years that 16-year-old Khalif Browder spent beaten and locked in solitary confinement in Rikers Island prison without ever being charged with a single crime. His suicide and his mother's heart attack 2 years later are not abstractions. They're the outcomes injustice enacted upon 2 bodies. Racism, sexism, ableism, homo and transphobia, ageism, fat phobia are algorithms created by humans' struggle to make peace with the body. A radical self-love world is a world free from systems of oppression that make it difficult and sometimes deadly to live in our bodies. A radical self-love world is a world that works for every body, and creating such a world is an inside-out job." Whew. We include this here because our framework, like Taylor's, specifically links the experience of trauma to the individual body and trauma to the collective and structural body. So racism, ableism, patriarchy, poverty, etc., we hold that interpersonal violence doesn't happen in a vacuum. That is to say that interpersonal violence only happens in the context of structural violence.
So let's look at some other definitions of body. Of course, we talk about physical bodies, right? Like skin, bone, muscles, blood, organs, as well as like planets or celestial bodies, right? It's a common everyday definition of body. The first definition of body in the Oxford Dictionary is the complete physical form of a person, plant, or animal. And folks, put a pin in that word complete because we're going to come back to that a little later. We're going to presume that people are fairly familiar with the use of body to describe the physical bodies, forms that we're walking around and moving around in. But there are many other uses of body that refer to groups of people. So another definition, a little later down in that same Oxford Dictionary, is a united or organized whole, an aggregate of individuals characterized by some common attribute, a collective mass. So here in the framework and in general use, sometimes we're talking about the body as a physical form. Sometimes we're using body as a metaphor or a word that is symbolic of something else. For example, we might talk about the student body at a school or a corporate body, which is a group of people or organization that has a distinct purpose and acts as a single entity, i.e., a corporation. Quick side note, the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court ruling determined that corporations are people, legal bodies, and therefore entitled to free speech in the forms of political campaign contributions. Hashtag all roads lead to campaign finance reform. But I digress. Okay, so what's the deal with bodies? Bodies take action, be it good, bad, neutral, otherwise. We need various muscle groups all to work together in harmonious coordination for our body to walk or pick up a cup of tea or soothe a loved one. It's great when friends in our posse or sometimes a cohesive professional or artistic team bring their unique selves because our collective action is somehow more than the combined sum of each individual. It just has that collective effervescence or collective magic. So most simply put, a collective body is a group of people that share some characteristic or experience. This can include shared identity groups, kin groups, or affinity groups. So think for just a moment about a group of close friends and how they interact. Be a group of your close friends. Are there central stories or inside jokes? Do you have specific words or phrases where like everybody automatically knows the meaning and the subtext and you know it's going to get a laugh and you're all going to have like a moment of connection? Do you have some shared traditions or holidays? Like I have a friend who is very, very good at celebrating friendiversaries with her long-term friends, which is like super adorable. Do you feel a connection and draw towards that group as a place of belonging? That is the connective tissue of that collective body. When there is shared joy, it reverberates in that body. And when there is shared struggle or trauma, it is either held and healed, transformed, or metastasized in that same body. And this is just one teeny tiny example. Public mourning or attending funerals is an act of a collective body, as is singing together at a concert, protesting in the streets, participating in civic action like voting or volunteering. In the political layer, the process of creating and passing a law is referred to as an act or actions. Systemic bodies are systems, right? Like the legal system or the educational system or the healthcare system or political system. We need countless complex, let's be clear, sometimes overly complex pieces to take action to build a system or transform a system. Systems are taking coordinated action all the time. Their bones are the law, policies, and regulations, and their connective tissue is the groups of people inside those systems that put those things into action. A policy written on a piece of paper is little more than physical substance of the paper without the specialized group of people who enact that policy on other people and animals and the planet. When groups of people put policies and laws into action, it creates and sustains the body of that system. At the intergenerational layer is where trauma is expressed and passed across generations, both genetically and behaviorally. We know more, though still very little, about the genetic transmission of trauma from the field of epigenetics. But in very brief, we know that certain stressors can turn on genetic markers that are passed on to the next generation that make that person at higher risk for stress, anxiety, and a range of other issues. However, it is important to also say we know that when bodies heal and interrupt those cycles of harm, some of those genetic markers can be turned off in the next generation, which is to say, even at the genetic level, healing is possible. Embodiment at the layer of historical trauma is the cultural body. This is the very big, very historical, long-standing collection of stories, beliefs, practices, language, symbols, and expression that all together comprise entire cultures or societies. Large-scale cultural healing can look like truth and reconciliation processes, meaningful, transformative legal efforts, and acknowledging and outlouding traumas that have been enacted by states and systems. There's this quote I love from Mary Pfeiffer. Social change is a million acts of kindness, but cultural change is a million subversive acts of resistance. It is hard to change or heal cultures. It requires doing and seeing ingrained things differently than how we were raised to do or see them. It is deep, difficult, and very necessary generational work, and it's our work to do.
So let's talk about one more example of how bodies act across layers, and that's voting. One individual casting a vote, right, is a person voting. Often we talk about it as an individual expressing their agency, right? And we use our bodies to record and submit a vote, either in person or through the mail, or, we raise our hand and we say, yay, right? We vote. When we vote together as a group or as a political body, at least presently in our system, as long as we get to keep our democracy, that collective act implements political will and power. So when we get together at a caucus or canvass or do any of the things that get a law passed or get somebody elected, we're engaging in a collective action, not just an individual action. So there's a way in which those individual actions aggregate, right? So voting is an embedded action, and it's also inside of a system that's regulated at the county and state level. And because it's nested with all those systems, it can be really convoluted for us to figure out what are we talking about when we're talking about the individual and the individual's relationship to this collective action. So I want to talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act, not the one that they're currently trying to pass, but the one they passed last time, was constructed specifically as a remedy to white supremacist and white racial animus and violence against Black people following the Civil War and the Age of Reconstruction. What we found was that during that time period, particularly in places where there are high concentrations of Black people, lots of Black people voted and lots of Black people got elected. And lots of white people who are used to running things got real mad about that and decided that they would cause an unbelievable amount of violence to restrict their ability to exercise their individual agency as individual citizens, and then also restrict their collective agency, their collective vote, right? Like as a people, as a cultural group, as Black people. And so what Elie Mystal refers to as the Cold Civil War up through the civil rights movements, there was this idea that we needed to provide protection to Black people as a group who had been disenfranchised and blocked from voting. And so when we look right now at current attacks on the rights of women, Black people, trans folks, Native people, immigrants, we have to understand that these are not disconnected assaults, but concerted efforts to traumatize groups of non-white, non-cis men into submission. It is a very specific white supremacist flex to let us know that white supremacy is not going down without a fight. Now, fast forward to 2013, the Supreme Court overturns sections of the Voting Rights Act piece by piece, right? And so what I've gotten to see in my lifetime is a clawing back, both a direct assault, but also an erosion of rights that folks had gotten really used to in this country. So we had restriction, remedy, and now we're back into this restrictive moment. And the process by which the will of the people would be enacted by a democratic republic, right? Again, like the act of collective agency, the thing that we are all a part of, is being interrupted actively by these individuals and groups. So why are we talking about this? The idea of healing a group or system or entire culture is huge and can feel overwhelming. And that's partially due to the scope of the problems, but also because we just don't always have a framework for it. We don't have the kind of social or cultural roadmaps about how to navigate conflict, take accountability, make amends or reparations, demonstrate change. And when we have those at the individual level or in the level with our families or with our groups of friends, we don't necessarily have that same roadmap, that same understanding of how we do that at a political level, at a systemic level. Part of why we developed this framework is so that people would have a roadmap that connects the individual act, right, of harm and repair to the cultural and political and social act of harm and repair. So I want to make one final point about this as we're talking about bodies and call back to the part of the definition of bodies that had to do with being complete or whole. And that's the recognition that the entireness of a body is the entireness of a body. So I can lose the feeling or the use or the actual limb, right? Like I can lose feeling in my hand and I'm still a complete body. I can lose the use of my hand. I'm still a complete body. I can actually lose my hand and I'm still a complete body, right? So we have to understand that the body isn't something that's perfect. It's just something that's whole. And so when we say we embody trauma and healing, what we mean is basically two things. One is that trauma and healing are quite literally in our bodies, not just our brain or our mind. And number two is that it's systemic, meaning that or holistic, right? It happens throughout the entire system, throughout the entire body, not just to one part. When we began practicing with this framework, the notion of embodiment wasn't as widely used as it is today. If you're interested in a deeper dive, there are lots of places to look. My favorite right now is, I think Princess Hemphill is probably the person who's doing the most writing and speaking on embodiment in a way that is like clear and just really potent and powerful. So check out the Embodiment Institute, check out What It Takes to Heal, go get your life. We'll list those in the show notes. Also, I do have to give a special shout out to generative somatics and all my somatics and social justice teachers and co-learners from the Seattle early aughts who first introduced me to the framing around what it means to embody trauma and healing. And part of what they said was that in the way that Leslie was just talking, right, that bodies act. Like that's one of the things that bodies do, that's what makes them bodies. What we talk about often is that bodies are in practice and they're always practicing something. And whatever they're practicing is what they're getting really, really good at. So as an individual body, as a collective body, as a political body, we're just getting better and better and better at whatever it is, the thing that we're doing, that we're practicing. Right now, our collective body is getting really good at repression, and our collective body is getting really good at resisting that repression, right? The tension that people talk about is that tension. It is the thing that we are practicing at that systemic level. But to take it back to maybe more familiar, we can think about it as like my own personal kind of physical body. So sometimes we can talk about it as habit, but one of the ways I think about it in my kind of own little personal physical body is not playing an instrument, because I don't play any instruments well, but I do drive, and I drive often. And the amount of attention that I had to bring to the act of driving when I first learned was really high, right? And I was like feeling everything, doing everything, like paying lots and lots and lots of attention. And then over time, that becomes embodied. It becomes kind of second nature. Even my sense of the vehicle and my sense of myself become closer together, right? My ability to kind of know about the size of this thing that I'm driving around. That is part of how embodiment operates, right? That we can go from something being a really attentive, intentional practice to something that's really habitual and habituated into our system. Now, harm and trauma can also be that way, right? If you've ever experienced twisting an ankle or breaking a leg or breaking another limb, the entire body has to shift and compensate, right? It has to change how it operates in order to make room for that injury and in order for that injury to actually have an opportunity to heal. So even if the impact is really specific and really acute, our entire body, brain, and behavior shift as a result. Even the aspects of ourselves that are really far away from that site of impact, right? If you've ever limped after that sprain, like your whole body shifts and hops, and you might look at a staircase that you've never thought about before. It's like, I don't like the way we even perceive our environment shifts, right? Around that particular injury, around that particular harm. So that's one of the ways and one of the reasons, one of the many that we talk about trauma and healing being embodied.
Built the framework in part on the concept of embodiment because it's holistic, like Teddy said earlier. It incorporates the thoughts, feelings, or emotions, and sensations. Understanding trauma and healing as embodied shifts us from the narrative that trauma is just this thing that breaks your brain to a more accurate framing that trauma impacts the whole body It can be incredibly disempowering to hear that you have a quote broken brain. And there are some very limited sets of mostly medical treatments that work for you individually. We also created the term body brain for this reason in the framework. So we can linguistically and conceptually, and I might even argue spiritually, stitch back together the body and the brain from which modern Western culture has severed. During our clinical training, we received this message over and over again that trauma was, as its Latin root suggests, a wound to one part of the self, and that it primarily impacts the individual. Essentially, trauma is something that impacts your brain, and you need to go get some specific evidence-based individual quote-unquote treatment to fix it. The tools that were most popular that came through and that we're kind of mostly surrounded by were about clinical interventions to address the wound through a one-on-one intervention.
Can I just say a thing? Because I think that there's this really clear piece when we talk about our education, because so much of the research around trauma came through these two pathways. One was soldiers who were in war, and the other were survivors of domestic violence, right? So primarily women who were surviving domestic violence and men who were coming home from war. And the clinical interventions that were developed were about how quickly can we get this soldier who has experienced this traumatic event, who is having all these trauma reactions, back into the field, right? Like that was the genesis, right? Like of so much of the research that we were being taught while we were in school. And I think so much of what we're responding to is the inadequacy of that.
Absolutely. That is, I think, the incompleteness, right? That's the like, what purpose is this definition actually serving? Who is it serving, and how is it serving them? And I think why it was also so important to us in the outset of developing the framework that this be for real people, right? Not just clinicians, that they be for the people who've survived trauma and those that love them, and that it's not explicitly a clinical model for that reason. So while we have strong evidence that trauma definitely impacts the brain and how it functions, like we know from looking at brains and fMRI machines that, folks that have experienced chronically traumatic or stressful conditions have a lot more activity in their amygdala or their part of their brain that regulates fight, flight, freeze, appease. But we also would contend that trauma and healing don't only happen in the brain, right? Like if you think about the concept of a gut feeling, right? When your spidey senses go off, when your threat detection system goes off, you don't feel it in your brain, you feel it in your gut. You usually feel it in your midsection. You might have that fluttering feeling, right? Like, but the idea of a gut instinct is really demonstrating that like your spidey senses, your sense of how you carry and process stress is actually happening in your body much lower than your brain. And our goal here, among other things, is to really re-embody healing and trauma. We endeavor to reinscribe it as something that happens in and to and within individuals and collective bodies and systems and cultures. Healing is much more accessible when we understand that anything that restores safety, agency, dignity, and belonging as pathways to healing. This is true at every layer of embodiment that we've described here so far. And again, we're going to dig more into that in future layers. But speaking about digging, Teddy,
Get
it's
it.
metaphor time. I love a good metaphor.
Oh my God. All right, y'all. So let's dig into this. So Ricardo Levins Morales, who is an amazing artist and cultural worker, published this zine. This is one of the chapters from a zine that's titled "The Soil is More Important Than the Seeds." And this is what he says in the beginning and the opening of this chapter. He says that one of the most important insights that cultural organizing has brought to movement struggle is the idea that the soil is more important than the seeds. He says almost anything will grow in rich, nutritious soil, whereas it's hard to get anything to grow if the soil is barren, toxic, and won't hold moisture. The seeds are our projects, our initiatives, our campaigns, our organizations, our institutions that we want to build. And the soil is the compost of beliefs, ideas, values, and narratives that create the environment in which we're working. So this is the metaphor that we're working with. When we talk about what it is to focus on the soil, right? The context in which we're operating, this is what that means. And the layers of soil that we describe, right, as intergenerational, historical, cultural, collective, individual, systemic, right? In each of those layers, safety, agency, dignity, and belonging are really crucial elements. And so at each of those levels, safety, agency, dignity, and belonging can be restored and promoted or can be eroded or exploded. Each layer of the soil needs those fundamentals. The way it is both disrupted and restored or amended is different, and yet all together, they make the ground beneath our feet, or maybe the ground in which we nestle and grow. The soil has porosity, right? It's not that each level has a barrier between one and the next, right? It's actually that each of the levels are compounding, right? So if I'm experiencing, like I've named, right? Like I live in New Orleans, I live in a state that is really trying to get after people voting, really trying to restrict people's access to healthcare, right? Like those are systemic things that are happening that are having very real impacts on people's lived lives. So the restriction of our collective agency may also be the restrictive of my individual agency. But as we said before, healing and trauma have to be embodied at both of those levels, right? Like at the same level. And so I can't just solely, only activate my individual agency in order to correct the assault on our collective agency. There has to be a collective moment too. There has to be a thing that is happening at that level. And I think maybe the last thing that I'll say is this piece that Leslie and I have noticed over the last few years, especially as she's been doing more of this work out of the country, that all of these layers, all of these concepts are socially specific, right? They sit within a specific social and cultural context that for us is this place that we currently live. When you go to other places, like, yes, we believe that these fundamentals are true for all humans and all beings, and they might actually, and very likely will, like look and manifest differently in those different spaces. So the how of agency here is going to look really different than the how of agency in Canada or Japan or Malawi, right? Like it's going to look real different. And so how we support agency, how we build belonging, how we amend the soil of those places is also going to have to be culturally, socially, and site specific.
I've been spending some time thinking about safety, agency, dignity, and belonging as, and bear with me here, this metaphor is not perfect yet, but social nutrients or social elements, right? I like to garden. I garden every year. I grew up with a garden and a mom who gardened. And so I got to learn from a young age what we put in the soil when the soil is a little too much clay or when the soil is a little too acidic or, what is light watering versus deep root watering, right? To speak to porosity. And over time, you start to think about it really granularly, like, oh, the leaves are yellow. We need to get some more nitrogen in there. And similarly, when I'm working with, young folks or families who are struggling, I find myself talking in terms of this young person has a real deficit of agency. This young person is really like struggling with their dignity. Like, how do we help fill their dignity bucket? How do we help them build just a little bit more agency today? And unfortunately, unlike with plants where you can, in fact, go put some fertilizer on them and it will amend itself, like with human beings, often we need to do those things repeatedly. But all of this is a sort of tending and caretaking and soil building, right? So you can think for yourself too, like, how are you tending or amending your soil? Like, if you need to build a little bit more safety or agency or dignity or belonging and kind of fertilize yourself with those social elements, like what specific actions or what specific relationships can you lean into to help rebuild those social elements?
This brother I was studying with in New Orleans as I was trying to, get my tea farm situation going, and he said that when you're he said that you're not feeding the plants, you're feeding the soil, right? That's the most important thing that you're actually doing. And so really being attentive to what you just said, right? Which is like, how are these different, how are our social nutrients? How are the nutrients for the soil? And whatever one is the least available is the one that will restrict the plant the most, right? And I think that is the same when we talk about these elements, right? So if I am mostly experiencing a lack of belonging, that is the thing that is going to most inhibit my ability to be fully well and to grow in the ways that I can.
Each layer has its own microbiome, right? So it's back to that the combination of the individual parts is somehow greater than the whole. And the soil metaphor and the safety, agency, dignity, belonging as these pieces of the soil really, we think, work in some of those same ways.
So I want to talk a moment as a facilitator, as a practitioner, right? I don't know, as opposed to as a farmer, I don't know, that most of my healing work happens in and with groups. And so when I'm working, I'm often sensing for that, what's happening with that collective body, right? Like, what does collective agency or dignity look like for this particular group? And, I remember, an organization that I was working with that had experienced high levels of collective trauma, specifically around an interruption of agency. And what happens is that they typically demonstrate high levels of hopelessness. They have a foreshortened future, right? I'm remembering an organization that was in a literal, like they call it a freeze. They're like, oh, we're in a hiring freeze. We're in a budget freeze, right? And for those of you who have heard the fight, flight, freeze response, are like, oh, like, is that accurate? I'm like, yes, that's accurate, right? Like they're actually in a moment, not of contraction, but of almost paralysis in order to get through this particular crisis or this particular traumatic moment or this particularly traumatic condition, which means they're not allocating new resources. They're not necessarily looking for new resources. And that any part of the organization that is trying to grow is, again, going to be really limited because what they believe and what they might be experiencing is that spending or allocation of funds or resources is a threat to the sustainability of the organization, survival of the organization. Now, while it might be necessary for an organization to pause new spending or hiring or expansion, similar to how an individual body might need to pause taking in new information or new sustenances and new sustenance or new resources, when there is not a clear plan of how the group will exit that freeze state, it can become stuck in this position. And an organization that is stuck in freeze has real difficulty in taking in new information and really limits its imagination. Just like an individual body that is too long in a freeze state, it doesn't have an opportunity to come back to baseline, is going to slowly erode its internal resources. Now, sometimes organizations don't know that they're in a freeze response or might not know how they're going to get out of it. That's cool. But then our opportunity or the necessity maybe is to reach out and really get some support and help. We know that most folks are not going to therapists for their trauma. They're mostly going to their homies. Part of the reason that we built this whole podcast was so that more of the homies would have more of this information so that when your homie comes to you and is like, hey, yo, this is what's happening for me, you can show up for them. And I think organizations are the same way, right? Groups are the same way. They need to be able to be connected to other folks so that they have an idea, so they can kind of get their imagination stoked about how they might emerge out of a freeze response, out of an endure response, and to find ways of what we would talk about kind of clinically or individually as co-regulation. Like you can also have group co-regulation happen, right? So an organization can come out of that freeze, have an idea of what the future holds, and make moves and adjustments in that direction. So again, just having the framework can be helpful for people who, leaders in organizations, individuals in families and groups who are finding themselves in that stuckness but don't actually know how to name it. This is how we name it. This is our little framework map to help y'all out.
So this statement is rooted in a basic social ecological framework, right? Or what a fancy pants term for a nested model, right? Where people are nested within families and neighborhoods and communities. And those families and neighborhoods or communities are nested within larger governing structures, institutions, and systems, which are all built and impacted by our shared history, right? And sometimes big catastrophic or big meaningful moments in history that shape policies and systems for many, many generations to come. But the bottom line, folks, is that no amount of individual therapy will return voting rights to the folks they've been stripped from. No amount of massage or Reiki or bubble baths or walking my dog, whom I love tremendously, but none of that is going to restore abortion rights to somebody living in Louisiana or Texas or Florida. And make no mistake, these are systemic harms to bodies of real human beings and of the larger body politic. Having your rights taken away, especially those rights that apply to our own bodily sovereignty and political power, are matters of agency and dignity and safety and belonging. So does this mean we should despair? No, 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 no. Please don't despair. Please don't burn it all down, at least not yet. It does mean that we can exercise individual agency and may need to get into some places and spaces and relationships that support our agency because it is being institutionally compromised. This is why organizing can be so collectively healing. When we have suffered a collective assault on our dignity, it can feel really personal. So depersonalizing it is part of the medicine. The social technology of consciousness raising has always been part of movements for this reason. It was essentially a way of letting folks know that they are not alone, that their individual experiences are tied to other people who have shared circumstances and conditions or identities, and that external conditions can be changed when we take collective action. So now when we look at the framework visually or present it to a group or individual, we highlight the way that healing and harm need to happen at the same layer to be most effective. We not only are trying to not start the story with secondly, but we're trying to couple trauma and healing together, because to just focus on trauma really isn't going to get us the healing, transformation, or birth us into the world that we want.
So here we are at the end. And for this episode, we invite you to consider where you could get together with others who are experiencing similarly traumatic conditions. For me, it is collective agency right now because I live in a state that's making it harder for Black people to vote again. And so I'm connecting with individuals and organizations who are about lifting up our collective agency. Maybe the circumstances are different for you, but wherever you are, pick something out of one of those layers and seek out individuals and organizations, groups in your area that are working to heal that interruption, to heal that disruption, to heal that disintegration, to push back against conditions that are damning or dimming or damning your safety, agency, dignity, or belonging. And our closing practice. So we've played around with metaphors today. We've gotten our virtual hands dirty, I don't know, or maybe soily, delving into this part of the framework that describes the layers or domains of trauma and healing. And as Leslie was saying, for healing to be most effective, it has to occur at the same domain or at the same level as the harm. So structural trauma has to be healed structurally. So for your homework this week, we have a choose your own adventure. If you're someone who tends to be more theoretical and are comfortable in that space, put your hands in some soil. Find an area around you and give some love to that soil. It might be a house plant. It might be in your yard. It might be at a nearby park or garden. Because I live in an agrarian state now, I know that many places have local ag centers or extension programs from their universities that'll also help you be a soil. You can literally be a master soil builder. That's a certification you can just get.
Are we master soil builders?
I'm an apprentice soil builder for sure.
Next episode.
So go literally go get your hands dirty, get your soil tested, see how it's doing. Get involved with folks who are doing literal soil building work, composting networks, native gardening groups, etc. If you're somebody who's used to doing that part, then give yourself a chance to get in your intellectual body about it. Do some research, right? Consider what are the harms that have happened to this soil? Who are the people who have nurtured this soil? What's the history of the soil in this area? What do I actually know? And what do the people around me know? So again, feel it out, get to where you need to go, but choose your adventure. All right. Thank you all for listening. Again, labor of love. Appreciate and affirm all of our labors. Thank you for affirming our labor. If you're interested in more, check out wholeagainpod.com. Transcripts, show notes, additional practice prompts will be there. It's also a place where you can reach out if you're interested in learning more about the framework or what we're doing with it. And I'm here to remind you, this is informational. It's for you and your homies to use and help yourself get well. It should be supplemental, but not in place of whatever healing modalities you're already engaged in. We are putting this out free to the universe in hopes that it finds folks and that folks find it helpful. So if that's you, let us know. The best way to let us know is to actually pass it along to someone else who you know who might benefit from it. For those of you who are interested in supporting the show financially, we do have a Patreon that goes directly to defraying the costs of recording and sound mixing. We are in a beautiful studio with amazingly talented producers and audio engineers, and we like them to get paid. Shout out to NAS Studios. Shout out to Blake. Shout out to producer Sylvia, chilling in the beanbag chair of Has Everything & Co. Shout out to these lands and waters here in the Pacific Northwest, the unceded lands and waters of the Duwamish.
Thanks, Teddy.
Thanks, Leslie.
Thanks, Blake. Wrap.